I grew up on the Navajo reservation, and the stories about skinwalkers have always given me the creeps. I've heard countless stories from my family and friends about these evil witches who can shapeshift into animals, and how they use their powers to harm people. But I never really believed in them until one night when I was driving home from a friend's house. It was around midnight, and I was driving down a deserted road when I saw something in the distance. At first, I thought it was a coyote, but as I got closer, I realized it was walking on two legs. It was a tall figure, with long arms and legs, and its eyes were glowing in the dark. My heart started racing, and I knew right away that it was a skinwalker. I tried to keep driving, but the creature started running towards my car, and I could see its face in the headlights. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its face was distorted, with sharp teeth and a long, crooked nose. I panicked and hit the gas pedal, but the creature was too fast. It jumped on the roof of my car, and I could hear its claws scratching the metal. I could feel its hot breath on my neck, and I knew that I was in danger. I remembered what my grandmother had told me about skinwalkers, that they are afraid of light and noise. So, I turned on the radio and blasted the music as loud as I could. I also turned on the interior lights of my car, hoping that it would scare the creature away. And it worked. The skinwalker screamed and jumped off my car, and I drove away as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was safely back home, and when I did, I saw the creature standing in the middle of the road, watching me. I never told anyone about what happened that night, but it still haunts me to this day. I know that I was lucky to survive, and I hope that I never have to encounter a skinwalker again. I've always been fascinated by stories of skinwalkers, wendigos, and other creatures that inhabit the wilderness. But after what I experienced a few years ago, I never want to encounter anything like that again. It was late fall, and I had decided to take a solo camping trip in the remote woods of northern Michigan. I had done this many times before and had always enjoyed the peace and quiet of being alone in nature. But this time, things were different. On the first night, I set up camp and started a fire. As I was sitting there, enjoying the warmth and watching the stars, I heard something moving in the bushes nearby. I dismissed it as a raccoon or a deer and tried to go back to my thoughts. But then I heard something else. Something that sounded like footsteps. I stood up and looked around, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. I shrugged it off and went to bed, hoping it was just my imagination. The next day, I went for a hike, and everything seemed fine. I saw some wildlife, enjoyed the scenery, and felt relaxed. But as the sun started to set, I got that uneasy feeling again. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I returned to my campsite and started another fire. I tried to distract myself by reading a book, but I couldn't concentrate. That's when I heard it. A low growling sound, coming from somewhere in the woods. I froze. I knew that wasn't any animal I'd ever heard before. I quickly put out the fire and climbed into my tent, hoping whatever was out there would go away. But it didn't. It stayed there, growling and making strange noises. I heard branches snapping and twigs crunching, and I knew something was circling my tent. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen with fear. It felt like hours. But eventually, the noises stopped, and everything was quiet. I stayed in my tent until morning, too scared to move. When I finally emerged from my tent, I saw that something had been outside. The ground was torn up, and there were deep claw marks on the trees. I packed up my things and left that day. I never saw whatever it was that was stalking me, but I knew it was something dangerous. Something that I never wanted to encounter again. I've since heard stories about gigoplers in the area, and I wonder if that's what I encountered. But whatever it was, it's a memory that still haunts me to this day. I had always heard rumors about the Gigopler, a mysterious one-eyed creature that roams the remote areas of the forest. People claimed to have seen it, but I always dismissed it as a myth. That was until I had my own encounter. It was a cool autumn evening, and I was out hiking in the woods. The sun had already set, and the forest was shrouded in darkness. I had a flashlight with me, but the beam was weak, and I had to rely on my sense of direction. I was walking along a narrow path when I heard something rustling in the bushes. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel. But then I heard it again, and this time it sounded closer. I turned on my flashlight and shone it in the direction of the noise. At first, I couldn't see anything, but then I noticed a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. They were large and yellow, and they seemed to be staring right at me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. That's when I saw it, the Gigopler. It was massive, standing at least 7 feet tall with long, spindly limbs. Its skin was ashen gray, and its eye was a deep red, like a burning ember. I wanted to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The Gigopler took a step forward, and I could see its razor-sharp teeth glinting in the dim light. It let out a low growl, and I knew I was in trouble. I tried to back away slowly, but the Gigopler matched my movements, never taking its eyes off me. It was like it was studying me, sizing me up for its next move. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at each other. It felt like hours, but it was probably only a few minutes. Then, suddenly, the Gigopler turned and disappeared into the forest. I stood there, shaking and terrified, for a long time after it left. Eventually, I managed to gather my wits and find my way back to my car. But I knew I would never forget that encounter, the night I came face to face with the Gigopler. I remember it like it was yesterday, even though it's been years since the incident. I was on a solo camping trip in the remote woods of northern Canada, miles away from any signs of civilization. I had been hiking all day, and as the sun began to set, I set up camp for the night. As I sat by my campfire, enjoying the solitude and tranquility of the wilderness, I heard a strange noise in the distance. It sounded like something was moving through the underbrush. I dismissed it as a wild animal and tried to focus on my thoughts. But the noise persisted, growing louder and more erratic with each passing moment. Suddenly, a loud howl pierced through the forest, and I froze in fear. I had never heard anything like it before. It sounded almost human, but with an otherworldly quality to it. My heart racing, I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously stepped away from the campfire, trying to peer through the darkness. That's when I saw it. A large, one-eyed creature, lurking in the shadows, staring at me with an intense gaze. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare. I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly grabbed my backpack and began to run. But the creature was fast, and it was chasing after me, its howls growing louder and more ferocious. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, and I knew that I was in serious danger. I didn't know how I managed to escape, but somehow I made it back to my car, and I sped away as fast as I could. I never looked back, too terrified to even imagine what was happening behind me. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. Maybe it was a Skinwalker or a Wendigo, or perhaps it was the elusive Gigopler that I had heard about. But one thing is for sure, I'll never forget the terror that I felt that night in the woods. And I'll never go camping alone again. I remember the day I saw the Gigopler. It was a warm summer evening, and I decided to take a walk in the woods behind my house. I always loved the peace and quiet of the forest, but that day, something was different. As I walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel like something was watching me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I got goosebumps all over my body. I turned around, but I couldn't see anything unusual. I shrugged it off and kept walking. But the feeling didn't go away. It was as if the woods were alive and watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. That's when I heard it. A low growl coming from behind me. I turned around again, and that's when I saw it. The Gigopler. It was tall and skinny, with matted fur and one large, bulging eye in the center of its head. Its body was twisted and contorted, like it had been pulled in different directions. And it was staring right at me. I froze, not sure what to do. I had never seen anything like it before, and I didn't know if it was friendly or dangerous. But then it started moving towards me, slowly at first, but then picking up speed. I turned and ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the Gigopler chasing me, its growls getting louder and more menacing with each passing moment. I don't know how I made it out of the woods that day. I just kept running until I saw the lights of my house in the distance. When I finally got home, I was covered in sweat and out of breath. I told my family what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They thought I had just seen a bear or a large dog. But I knew what I saw. And I'll never forget that terrifying encounter with the Gigopler in the woods. I can hardly bring myself to write about what happened to me a few months ago, but I feel like I need to share my experience with others. It started out as a normal camping trip with a group of friends. We had chosen a remote area deep in the woods, far away from any towns or cities. I had heard rumors of strange creatures lurking in these parts, but I brushed them off as urban legends. That was my first mistake. On the second night, we were sitting around a campfire, roasting marshmallows, and telling ghost stories. I felt like something was watching us from the darkness beyond the firelight. It was a feeling I couldn't shake off. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination running wild. Then, we heard something moving in the bushes nearby. We all turned towards the sound and saw a creature emerging from the woods. It was a Gigopler, its one eye glowing in the dark. Its appearance was unlike anything I had ever seen before. The creature was taller than any human I had ever met, and its arms were abnormally long, dragging on the ground. Its skin was a sickly shade of green, and it looked as though it was decaying. We froze, not knowing what to do. The creature seemed to be staring straight at us, but its eye was so milky and blank that I couldn't tell for sure. Then, it let out a blood-curdling screech that echoed through the forest. We knew we had to leave. We packed up our belongings as quickly as we could, but the Gigopler was already closing in on us. It was like it knew exactly where we were headed. It seemed to be toying with us, getting closer and closer with each passing moment. We ran as fast as we could through the woods, the creature's screeches echoing in our ears. It was like something out of a nightmare. We finally made it to our car and sped off down the dirt road, the Gigopler disappearing into the woods behind us. I never thought I would encounter such a terrifying creature in my life. It still haunts me to this day, and I can't help but wonder if there are more out there, lurking in the shadows. If you ever find yourself in a remote area like we did, be sure to stay alert and watch out for anything out of the ordinary. You never know what could be lurking in the darkness. I've always loved hiking and exploring the wilderness, but after what happened to me last summer, I think I might stick to urban adventures from now on. It was a warm evening in late August, and I was camping alone in a remote area of the Rocky Mountains. I had set up my tent near a crystal clear stream and planned to spend a few days fishing, hiking, and enjoying the beautiful scenery. On the second night of my trip, I woke up to the sound of rustling outside my tent. At first, I thought it might be a deer or a bear, but as the noise grew louder, I realized that it was something else entirely. I could hear something snuffling and grunting just a few feet away from my tent. It was so close that I could feel the ground vibrating under me. I sat up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent door. What I saw outside made my blood run cold. Standing in the moonlight was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was about 7 feet tall, with matted fur and a single glowing red eye in the center of its forehead. It had long, sharp claws and a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth. I froze in terror as the creature stared at me with its single red eye. It let out a low growl, and I could feel the ground shaking beneath me. I knew I had to get out of there fast, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. Finally, I managed to find my voice. "What do you want?" I croaked. The creature let out a high-pitched screech and started to lumber toward me. I scrambled out of the tent and ran as fast as I could toward my car. I could hear the creature's heavy breathing and pounding footsteps behind me as I ran. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. I don't know how I managed to make it to my car, but somehow I did. I fumbled with the keys and managed to unlock the doors just as the creature reached me. I jumped into the car and slammed the door shut, panting and sweating. The creature slammed into the car with incredible force, but thankfully the door held. I could see its single red eye glaring at me through the window, and I knew I had to get out of there before it broke through the glass. I started the car and peeled out of the campsite, my heart pounding in my chest. I drove as fast as I could down the winding mountain roads until I finally reached civilization. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station where I could call for help. The police didn't believe my story, of course. They just thought I was some crazy person who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. But I know what I saw that night. I saw a Gigopler, a creature that I had never heard of before, but that I will never forget for the rest of my life. I never believed in the paranormal until I encountered a Gigopler. It happened last summer when my friends and I decided to take a camping trip to a remote forest in northern Canada. We were all excited to disconnect from our busy lives and immerse ourselves in nature for a few days. However, we had no idea what was waiting for us in the woods. On the first night of our trip, we set up our tents and started a campfire. We talked, laughed, and enjoyed some beers until it was time to go to sleep. That's when we heard it, a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the forest. It sounded like nothing we had ever heard before, and it sent shivers down our spines. At first, we thought it was just a wild animal, so we shrugged it off and went to sleep. However, the next night, we heard it again, and this time it was closer. We started to feel uneasy, but we still didn't want to believe that it was something otherworldly. On the third night, things took a turn for the worse. We woke up to find that one of our friends was missing. We searched for him frantically, but we couldn't find any trace of him. That's when we noticed a strange smell that permeated the air. It smelled like rotting flesh, and it made us all gag. We started to hear strange noises, like something was moving around our campsite. We tried to stay quiet and still, hoping that whatever it was would leave us alone. However, it didn't. We saw a shadow moving in the distance, and it was getting closer and closer. As it got closer, we could make out its form, a huge, one-eyed creature that looked like it was made out of shadows. It was a Gigopler, and it was looking right at us. We were frozen in fear, unable to move or speak. The Gigopler let out a piercing scream, and we knew we had to get out of there. We ran as fast as we could, stumbling over roots and branches in the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the safety of our cars. We never went back to that forest again, and we never spoke about what happened to us that night. We all knew that if we did, no one would believe us. But we knew the truth, that there are things in this world that we can't explain or understand. And that the Gigopler is one of them. I never believed in the supernatural until I had my own encounter. It happened a few years ago when I was living in a small town in the southwest. My house was on the edge of town, and behind it stretched miles of desert, home to coyotes, rattlesnakes, and maybe something more sinister. One night, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I heard a strange noise outside. It sounded like a person making animal sounds, like a coyote or a wolf. I didn't think much of it at first, but the noise grew louder and more insistent. It was getting closer to the house. I got up to investigate and looked out the window. What I saw made my blood run cold. In the moonlight, I could make out a figure that was clearly not human. It was walking on two legs, but its body was twisted and contorted in a way that no human could manage. Its eyes were glowing red, and it was making those animal noises. I knew right away what it was. A skinwalker. I had heard stories about them, how they were humans who had the ability to transform into animals. But I never thought I would encounter one myself. I backed away from the window and locked all the doors and windows. But the skinwalker kept getting closer. It was scratching at the walls and windows, trying to get in. I could hear its ragged breathing and its claws scraping against the wood. I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. I thought about calling the police, but I didn't know how to explain what was happening. They would think I was crazy. As the night wore on, the skinwalker's attacks grew more frenzied. It seemed to be getting angrier and more determined. I was afraid it would break through the windows and attack me. But then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the skinwalker stopped. It let out one final howl and then was gone. I didn't hear any more noises outside. I stayed up all night, too scared to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check for any signs of the skinwalker. There were scratch marks on the walls and windows, but otherwise, there was no trace of it. To this day, I don't know what the skinwalker wanted from me. Maybe it was just passing through, or maybe it had a more sinister purpose. But I'll never forget that night, and I'll never doubt the existence of the supernatural again. I've always been drawn to the great outdoors. The solitude, the fresh air, and the beautiful scenery have always been my escape from the chaos of everyday life. I've gone on countless camping trips, but one particular trip still haunts me to this day. It was late autumn, and I decided to venture into a remote forest in the Pacific Northwest. The foliage was ablaze with oranges, yellows, and reds, and the crisp air was invigorating. As the sun began to set, I set up camp and started a fire. As I sat, sipping my coffee and enjoying the warmth of the fire, I heard a rustling in the bushes. At first, I didn't think anything of it. Maybe it was a deer or a bear. But as the rustling grew louder, my unease grew. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the bushes. It was a tall, thin creature with matted fur and one glowing eye. It looked like a gigopler, a creature I had heard about in local legends. I froze in fear as the creature approached me. It had razor-sharp teeth and emitted a putrid odor. It seemed to be sizing me up, deciding whether or not I was its next meal. My mind raced as I tried to come up with a plan. Should I try to run? Should I fight? But before I could make a move, the creature suddenly turned and darted back into the woods. I sat there, shaken and confused, wondering what had just happened. I didn't sleep a wink that night, and every sound made me jump. The next morning, I packed up my gear and hightailed it out of there. To this day, I don't know what would have happened if the Gigopler hadn't backed off. I'm just grateful that I'm here to tell the tale. But one thing is for sure, I won't be venturing into remote forests alone again. I was hiking alone in the remote forests of northern Canada. It was a beautiful day, the sun was shining, and the air was crisp. I had been on the trail for a few hours and had not seen anyone else. It was just me and the sounds of the forest. As I walked deeper into the woods, the trees began to grow taller, and the underbrush became thicker. The trail was becoming harder to follow, and I started to worry that I might get lost. But I pressed on, determined to see what lay ahead. That's when I heard it. A low growling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I froze in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around, trying to find the source of the sound, but there was nothing there. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance. It was tall and thin, with long arms and legs. Its skin was gray and its eyes glowed with an eerie light. I knew immediately what it was, a Wendigo. I had heard stories about Wendigos before, and I knew that they were dangerous creatures that preyed on humans. I had never believed in them, but now, as I looked at the creature before me, I knew that they were real. The Wendigo started to move toward me, its long arms reaching out as if to grab me. I turned and ran as fast as I could, the sound of its growls echoing in my ears. I ran for what felt like hours, my legs burning with exertion. Finally, I collapsed on the ground, gasping for breath. When I looked up, I saw that the Wendigo was gone. I stumbled back to civilization, shaken and terrified by what I had seen. I told my friends and family about the encounter, but no one believed me. They thought I was making it up, or that I had simply been imagining things. But I know what I saw. And I will never forget the terror I felt when I came face to face with the Wendigo in the remote forests of northern Canada. I have a story to tell, one that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It's a story that I would rather forget, but I can't, because it's still out there, lurking in the shadows. It was a warm summer evening, and I was out camping with a group of friends. We had found a secluded spot in the woods, miles away from civilization. It was the perfect place to get away from the stress of everyday life and enjoy the peace and quiet of nature. As we settled down for the night, we heard something rustling in the bushes. At first, we thought it was just an animal, but then we heard a low growl, and our blood froze in our veins. It wasn't an animal, it was something else. We didn't know what it was, but we could feel its presence, and it was getting closer. We quickly grabbed our flashlights and tried to shine them into the darkness, but whatever it was too fast, too elusive. We could hear it circling us, but we couldn't see it. That's when I saw it. It was a Gigopler, its one eye glowing in the darkness, its long, sharp claws digging into the ground. It was like nothing I had ever seen before, and I knew we were in trouble. We tried to run, but it was too late. The Gigopler was on us in seconds, its claws tearing into flesh, its teeth gnashing. We fought back with everything we had, but it was no use. The Gigopler was too strong, too fast, too vicious. I don't know how we survived that night. Maybe it was luck, or maybe it was something else. All I know is that we made it out alive, battered and bruised, but alive. Now, whenever I go camping, I always keep one eye on the darkness, looking out for any signs of the Gigopler. I don't want to meet it again, and I don't want anyone else to either. It's out there, somewhere, waiting for its next victim. So be careful when you're out in the woods, and always remember that the darkness is never truly empty. I was always told to never venture too far into the woods behind my grandparents' house, but being the curious kid I was, I always found myself exploring deeper and deeper into the forest. It wasn't until one summer when I was visiting my grandparents that I had my first encounter with something I couldn't explain. I was out exploring as usual when I heard a strange rustling sound behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. I shrugged it off and continued on my way. But the rustling sound didn't stop. It only got louder and closer. I started to feel uneasy, like I was being watched. I quickened my pace, but the rustling only grew louder still. That's when I heard it, a sound that still haunts me to this day. A bone-chilling howl that seemed to come from all around me. I froze in fear, not knowing what to do. That's when I saw it, or at least I thought I did. A figure moving in the trees, just out of sight. It was too big to be a normal animal, but it moved like one. It was almost like it was mimicking the movements of a deer. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were glued to the ground. I was too scared to move. That's when the figure stepped out of the trees, and I saw what it really was. It was a skinwalker, or at least that's what I've been told. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. Its body was twisted and contorted, like it was broken in all the wrong places. Its eyes were black and lifeless, and its skin was mottled and patchy. I don't know how I managed to get away, but somehow I did. I ran back to my grandparents' house, never looking back. That experience changed me forever. I still have nightmares about it, and I never venture too far into the woods anymore. But every time I visit my grandparents, I can still feel the skinwalker watching me, waiting for me to make the same mistake twice. I'll never forget the day I saw the skinwalker. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I had decided to take a walk in the woods near my house. The leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way deeper into the forest. As I walked, I began to feel uneasy. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, but the feeling only grew stronger. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the bushes. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest. A figure emerged from the foliage, and I gasped in horror. It was a creature unlike anything I had ever seen before. Its skin was leathery and covered in fur, and its eyes glinted with a sinister intelligence. I knew instantly that I was face to face with a skinwalker. I had heard the stories growing up, but I had never believed they were real. Yet here it was, right in front of me. The skinwalker started to advance towards me, and I knew I had to run. I turned on my heel and sprinted back towards my house, not daring to look back. I could hear its footsteps pounding behind me, and I knew that it was gaining on me. Finally, I burst through the trees and saw my house in the distance. I mustered every ounce of strength I had left and ran towards it as fast as I could. When I finally reached my front door, I slammed it shut and locked it behind me. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I had never been so terrified in my life. From that day on, I never ventured into those woods again. I knew that the skinwalker was still out there, lurking in the shadows and waiting for its next victim. I'm from the Navajo Nation, and I grew up hearing stories about skinwalkers. My parents and grandparents always told me to stay away from them, to not speak of them, and to never trust anyone who spoke about them freely. But like any curious child, I always wondered what they looked like and what they could do. It wasn't until I was a young adult that I had my own encounter with a skinwalker. I was camping with some friends on a remote part of the reservation, where we could see the stars in all their glory. It was a peaceful night, and we were all sitting around the campfire, talking and roasting marshmallows. That's when we heard it. A low growl coming from the darkness beyond the trees. We all froze, unsure of what it could be. It didn't sound like any animal we knew of. It was too deep and too guttural. Suddenly, we saw movement in the shadows. Something was coming towards us, something that looked almost human, but not quite right. It was hunched over, its arms dangling down past its knees. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and its skin looked slick and oily. We were all frozen in terror, unable to move or speak. The Skinwalker continued to approach us, its movements slow and deliberate. It was as if it was savoring the fear it was causing us. But then, something strange happened. My cousin, who was sitting closest to the Skinwalker, suddenly stood up and started speaking in Navajo. I couldn't understand what she was saying, but it sounded like a prayer or a chant. The Skinwalker stopped in its tracks and stared at her, its eyes narrowing. My cousin kept speaking, her voice growing louder and more confident. The Skinwalker seemed to be getting angrier, but it was also hesitant to approach us any further. Finally, my cousin finished her prayer and the Skinwalker turned and disappeared into the darkness. We were all shaken and confused, unsure of what had just happened. But we knew one thing for sure, we had just encountered a Skinwalker, and we had narrowly escaped its grasp. We packed up our camp and left that night, too afraid to stay any longer. But the memory of that encounter has stayed with me, and I will never forget the terror I felt when I saw that creature approach us in the darkness. I'll never forget the day I saw a Skinwalker. It was a warm summer evening, and I was driving back from a camping trip in the mountains with my friend. We were both exhausted from the long hike we had taken that day, and we were looking forward to getting back to civilization. As we were driving down a desolate dirt road, we saw something moving in the trees. At first, we thought it was a deer or a bear, but as it stepped out into the road, we realized it was something else entirely. It was a human, or at least it looked like one, but there was something wrong with it. Its limbs were too long, and its movements were jerky and unnatural. Its eyes glowed in the darkness, and it seemed to be staring right at us. My friend and I were frozen in terror as the creature began to walk towards us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to start the car, but it wouldn't budge. It was like the engine had been completely shut off. The Skinwalker was getting closer, and I could see its twisted face clearly now. It had the face of an animal, but I couldn't tell what kind. Its teeth were sharp and pointed, and its breath was hot and fetid. Suddenly, the creature let out a piercing shriek that made my blood run cold. It was like nothing I had ever heard before, and it seemed to be summoning others of its kind. I don't know how long we sat there, trapped in the car with that thing outside. It felt like hours, but it was probably only minutes. Eventually, the Skinwalker retreated back into the woods, and we were able to start the car and get out of there. We never spoke about that night again, but it's a memory that has haunted me ever since. I know that Skinwalkers are a part of Native American folklore, but I never thought I would actually encounter one. I'm just grateful that we made it out alive. I grew up in a small Navajo community in Arizona, and as a child, I always heard stories about skinwalkers. For those who don't know, skinwalkers are witches who can transform into animals and can bring harm to those around them. As a child, I thought these stories were just myths, but one night changed everything. It was a cold winter night, and I was driving back from a friend's house on the outskirts of our community. As I was driving, I noticed a coyote on the side of the road. I slowed down, thinking it might run across, but it just stared at me. Its eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, the coyote disappeared from sight, and I heard a rustling in the bushes nearby. I started to feel uneasy and decided to drive away as quickly as I could. But before I could hit the gas, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was a figure, hunched over and moving in a strange way. It was too dark to see any details, but I knew it wasn't human. My heart was racing as I tried to start my car. It took a few tries, but I finally got the engine to turn over. As I started to drive away, I saw the figure stand up and start to run after me. It was like nothing I had ever seen before. It moved quickly and effortlessly, almost like it was gliding across the ground. I drove as fast as I could, but the figure kept up with me, getting closer and closer. I could hear it snarling and growling behind me, and I knew I was in trouble. I tried to think of a way to get away, but it was like the figure was always right there, just out of sight. Finally, I reached the edge of our community, and I saw the lights of our town. As I drove into town, the figure stopped pursuing me, disappearing into the darkness. I felt a sense of relief wash over me, but the memory of that night has never left me. I later learned from my grandfather that skinwalkers were real and that they could bring harm to those who crossed their paths. I never forgot that night and always made sure to stay close to home after dark. I may have lived to tell the tale, but I knew that not everyone was so lucky.